Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we have this big discussion on the conflict. Yesterday we discussed the various sort of the conflict in society, and you also came to know how the conflict come into the limelight. The major role is played by the reporters, the newsmen, who brings out the conflict, different sort of the conflict, whether it's political, socio, or economics. They bring into the limelight, but they also go through a different sort of problems. What they feel, how do they report? We will talk about all these issues. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Professor Shivaji Sarkar. He has been practicing journalist. He writes a column on socio-political and economic issue. He has been experience of working in financial experience and was in core team of the designing of Patriot newspaper. And he also have a keen eye on how the conflicts in the society is harming the developments, and keeps reporting on all these issues. So I hope his knowledge will help us to understand this topic in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Professor Sarkar for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. See, this conflict actually, quite often we get confused what exactly conflict is and how the newsmen face the conflict. In fact, if you see, when you say newsmen in conflict situation, our view is very limited. We feel that it should be on the borders, the conflict would be there. We feel it is limited to terrorism. We feel it is limited to wherever there is some armed action. This is largely the normal view of conflict that any average person has. But a newsman actually has to go into much deeper conflicts almost every day of his life. It is very wide and it splits into almost every aspect of his life. Don't think that if a newsman is functioning to cover a simple crime story, he doesn't face conflict there. If a newsman goes to cover, say, a public meeting, don't think he's not facing some kind of conflict there. He may be facing conflicts even while he's going out on a normal beat to cover any simple story. The conflicts are very wide. Conflicts are there at every point, and newsman has to come out of this situation every day in different ways through different kinds of practices and different kinds of skills that he has to face. Now, where can we have these kinds of conflicts? We can have the conflicts almost with every day with the administration. Yes, it may be the district administration, it may be the local administration, it may be even a health administration, it may be in a state electricity board, it may be an archaeological survey. Quite often you would feel, wow, there can be a conflict in these innocuous places. Yes, that is one question everyone feels and everyone wants to ask. You see, when it comes to coverage of any event, there is one mindset of the journalist and there is another mindset of the persons who are being covered. Largely, the journalist wants to come out with facts which are real and which affects the society, because what purpose the journalism is, that also we need to understand. The basic purpose of journalism is to create an open dialogue in the society, and in the creation of that open dialogue in the society, journalist has to bring out all facts that are relevant to any issue. Now, say it is a crime. Now, why should the administration come in between the coverage of a story in which virtually administration has not played any role? If it is a murder, if it is an accident, the perpetrator of the crime is somebody else. But why the administration is always very skeptic about it? They are skeptic for the reason that these incidents that occur somewhere or other, it reflects on their functioning. And they do not want journalists to bring out wherever they have a role in it. In short, their failures, whatever it is, must not be covered. That is what they want. But if a journalist tries to cover that up, that will be a kind of a censorship. And if there is a censorship, that means the facts would not come out as they are supposed to come out. So the administration officials, they may be district officials, they may be officials at various other levels, they may be officials, say, in a hospital. You go to the hospital, you see so many things, you want to cover it, you want to ask questions, and they feel uncomfortable. And in fact, Archaeological Survey of India or any other state archaeological survey, I'm telling you from my own personal experience, when I went to cover an event and I asked some questions to the topmost person there about certain things happening in that place, he virtually, in a very sober and a sweet note, gave me a small threat. You can't even say it as a threat, it was so couched in so sweet words. He said, if you do it like that, if you ask such uncomfortable questions, I would see that you may not come to this place next time. So this is how it happens. This is how a newsman has to solve or face the conflicts. And this is where a journalist has also to learn the skills to solve the conflicts, because if he doesn't resolve those conflicts, he would not be able to function in his day-to-day life. So conflict is there almost at every level with the administration. Conflict is there also with the policemen. You see, the policemen, they do not want anything to be covered as it happens, because the way the police manual has been made and way their performance parameters are judged, they do not want that all those right things should come out. And for that, they can do and go to any extent possible to stop coverage of certain facts. And if you are a conscious journalist, and if you are bringing out all those facts gradually, they feel so uncomfortable. They create many hurdles, many problems for the journalist, and in the most acute scenario, they even go to the extent of creating situations that they deliberately plant something which is not there, and then, of course, the journalist's credibility is questioned, and the organization has least option but to remove him, and that is exactly where these people succeed. So conflicts go into very large and deep areas, and a journalist, while functioning, has not only to plan what he has to cover, but also plan ahead of it. He has to see a future vision that whatever way he is functioning, he should not only function today, but his tomorrow's function also should not be affected. Now there is conflict also with the politicians. Quite often it is said politicians are very nice persons, but they are nice, no doubt, but they are always not saints. That is what we need to understand. You see, quite often we talk of the internal emergency, and we say that it was created by the politicians so that many things could remain swept under the carpet. But emergency is not a one-time affair actually. When a journalist functions, he feels that emergency is almost an everyday affair that he has to counter with. And it is not restricted to the center. It is in every state, it is like that. Whether it is the state of UP, whether it is the state of Manipur, which is always in trouble, whether it is the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where the insurgency is at a high pitch, or even say the Maoist dominated areas in Chhattisgarh, or even say a very simple area like Tamil Nadu, where lots of political wranglings go on, and wranglings are on between different political parties. Journalists often become a victim for no fault of his. And in this kind of scenarios, the journalists and politicians virtually, quite often people say they are in league. In fact, they are not in league, they are almost at loggerheads. And this is one thing you have to understand, how political parties do it very subtly in day-to-day dealings. You see, In everyday affair, a politician would be very sweet, very nice. They would offer you tea, coffee, good drinks, good food, will be nice talker, everything. But when you want to ask some real difficult question, you will find them not so available to you, or they also start become difficult, or they would not answer your questions. And that is the time when a journalist has to take his extra effort to reach to the facts that he has to report. I'm saying facts because truth is perceptive, facts are real. Truth can be different for different persons, but fact will remain the same for everybody. So a journalist works exactly not for truth but for facts, and facts always speak the truth. That is why my stress repeatedly is on facts. Now, how ruthless can politicians be? Well, a good politician, a nice politician, possibly would say, would not try to meet the journalist from the next time. But there are people, and this happens almost in anywhere, everywhere, especially in places away from the main centers of activity in a state or the center like Delhi, the state national capital. Now there are many instances, even normally a very nice state like Odisha also, we have seen journalists not now, in 60s, 70s and 80s being hounded. Their families were hounded. Their family men were killed. Their family men were raped. And situation has been very difficult for the journalist to cover all those incidents which were happening to them. In 1984, the Bihar government brought out a bill which was called the Bihar Press Bill. It was an extreme bill which virtually conceived of how to repress the press, how to repress free coverage of any event. And in such situations, the journalists have little option but to counter such conflicts. And in the case of Bihar Press Bill, journalists, along with all intellectuals from different parts of the society all over the country, they came out literally on the streets all over the nation and also on the streets of Delhi to protest against this kind of a draconian measure. And finally, that bill had to be shelved. So this is how you see issues go on. In many cases, in states like UP, you can say even Maharashtra, and what not, any state you name there, you will find these kind of situations happening where the journalists are assaulted. If not assaulted, they try to assuage newsmen. And through assuaging means, they are virtually literally given gifts, money and many other things, which is against the basic ethical concept of the journalistic profession. And now how in a state where virtually the journalists have very little protection, because journalism in one institution where somehow the industry doesn't extend so much of protection to individual journalists, they have their limitations of money and many other aspects. So journalists in those situations have to counter these situations in a very difficult way, and they have also to see that in their all these happenings, their professional functioning is not affected. Now recently we have seen the stories of some of the tapes that has caused immense problems in the coverage everywhere. And the media industry in this country faces serious dilemmas, basically because they have also to reconcile to the revenue model. And the revenue model is highly dependent on advertising. And this is where again another dichotomy begins. How a journalist can prevent a conflict with a company or people who are giving advertisements. It is not just that the private sector companies behave in a naughty way. Even public sector companies do that. There are many instances where public sector companies, when they found in a particular newspaper or any news organization has given coverage which was not favorable to them, they stopped advertising. Now you would say it is unethical, but this happens in the practical life. And when this happens, the management gets slightly dizzy And they also want that journalists should not create problem in the revenue earning models. So this creates conflict. And what conflict is that? It is the conflict how the quality of news gathering is to be maintained in an increasingly competitive atmosphere. So the conflict is there that you have to give the right news, and the conflict is also there if you give the right news, your revenue model can be affected. So how to create that balance? This is in fact not a physical assault, but it creates a lot of stress and strain on the functioning of the individual journalist. How he would function, because he doesn't want that the revenue model of his bread earner should be affected. He also doesn't want that his conscience should be affected by not covering what people should know. Now, in the recent Neera Radia tapes that we are discussed in very widely in the media and elsewhere also, we found these questions came out in a very wide way. And Press Council of India also set up study teams to find out what exactly is the truth. And they found out the truth also. And they found out linkages between the corporate houses and some of the journalists also. Now, this is a cause of worry. And the cause of worry is also because the newspapers, as they function, especially in this country and many other parts of the world, they are highly dependent on advertisement revenue, and the circulation revenue or the revenue that comes from the sales of a newspaper, or say even selling of the news channel, is hardly enough to meet their day-to-day needs even. Virtually, newspapers or news channels sell their products at a very subsidized rate, and this subsidy comes from advertising. So naturally, advertising creates a conflict of conscience within the media. It creates a conflict of ethics within the media. How it would solve, that again remains left to the media houses themselves. Army and paramilitary forces are yet another sources of conflict. Of course, we have been discussing that about the armed conflicts. But while they're supposed to fight out those who are fighting with them with the arms, is fine. But when they go out, say, in an insurgent affected area, or say terrorist affected area, or any disturbed area for that matter, it is very common knowledge that they do not behave the way they are supposed to behave in the professional manner. They barge into very civilian areas, they commit many kinds of things that they normally should not do. And now this becomes a problem for the journalist, whether they should cover it or not cover it. If they cover it, these armed forces are there to take revenge on them. If they don't cover it, the insurgents groups are there to function in the same way with them. So journalist gets into virtually between two kinds of conflicts, and he has to emerge unscathed. Whether it always becomes possible or not, that is another question. We have to go into details of that. Possibly that can be a subject of discussion for another lecture. But we have seen that in these kinds of scenarios, the army or paramilitary forces also function as virtual censors. Yes, they censor news. They do not allow whatever is happening to be published. And the journalists who remain in those areas, if they really do it, they face the threat of being arrested, put behind bars, and in the worst case scenario, even being eliminated. They can torment journalists in many ways. And Northeast, Jammu and Kashmir, Manipur, or the Naxal hit areas in many parts of this country, journalists are often the target for telling the factual truth. So the conflict, you can understand, is how wide it is. Now, Again, I would say, just to repeat what I said earlier, the journalism is basically to create an open dialogue in the society. And this is possible when whatever is happening to the people in the society is reported as it is happening. But in these kinds of scenarios, it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult in many ways how you report the real event that has happened like that. And I can tell you, journalists never believe that they have to live in this kind of situation. They do not want to suppress anything, but quite often they are unable to tell what they should be. In fact, in many areas like Manipur and Northeast, Jammu and Kashmir, and even Naxal-hit areas, there are journalists who could not be allowed to go out of their area to give a proper coverage. This is the fact. This is the reality of life. There's another aspect we often face. Just now we discussed the tapes of Neera Radia. But there is another aspect that is called corporate sovereignty. You see, this concept has come up in the 60s. It has started from the United States of America. And there, the multinational corporations virtually were at war with the state. It started with, of course, the USA. Then they start, now we can see it has manifested globally. What they were saying in the 60s, when the US government wanted to impose restriction on these companies, on their functioning in many ways, legal restraints and ethical restraints, these companies said, you see, you are a small country. Yes, even the US is a small country. You function within geographical limit, a territorial boundary. We are multinationals. We are beyond any territories. We function in many territories. So we cannot accept the law that you make. And now, the MNCs since then have become much more powerful. They function almost everywhere, in almost every country now. And they say they have their own sovereignty, and their sovereignties can't be challenged by any national sovereignties. And this comes virtually in conflict with the national ethos, and mostly journalists, since adhere to the national ethos, they also come in conflict with them. And they say, we have the right to advertise the way we want. That is the supremacy of the advertiser. Can we accept that? Can any citizen accept that? That whatever is being advertised is definitely not the truth. Advertisement is always some exaggeration of what actually is being offered. And if a journalist wants to expose that, tell the consumer that this is exactly is happening, the MNCs swoop down on the journalists, swoop down on the news organizations. They are very powerful. They are very organized. They have lots of money. They can dictate terms, and they are dictating terms. That is how you see this Neera Radia type tapes are happening. It is just not that they only want that advertisements should be as they want. They also want that advertisements should be passed on as news. How a journalist should prevent that? Can an editor prevent that? Can a management prevent that? They do not want it, but again, it is an ethical conflict they have to live with. We have seen in the Neera Radia tapes how they lure journalists. They lure journalists in many ways. By giving them employment, by giving them gifts, giving them many other things. And also promising something which normally possibly a journalist can't ever imagine or dream of. If you do not fall into their line, they are very powerful again, I would say. They can arm twist. And arm twisting can be of many kinds. Then the worst is, they can ease out the most uncomfortable journalists by maligning or pressurizing the management. And that means a journalist just loses his jobs. If it is a softer target, if it is a softer action, possibly he would lose his beat. But in many cases, When the conflict comes between revenue earning and sacrificing a journalist, management prefer to do the latter. So you have to see how the entire news system, the management, the editor, the journalist, they're having a continuous kind of conflict with the corporates. And this continues. This has been continuing for the last many decades, and this is continuing even now. No proper solution has yet been found to it. Of course, journalists try to put as much as possible check on it, but it doesn't always become successful. Now, there is another aspect we have seen, the paid news. What is this paid news? Is it a new phenomenon? It has come up only during the last 1 or 2 years. We have been discussing this in a wide manner, in intrinsic manner. And overall view, whether it is the Press Council of India, any politician, any individual, any citizen, any official, they all say paid news is bad news. Because paid news is not news. It is something that someone wants for himself to be publicized, and he pays to the organization and gets a nice publicity, and that is all paid for by him but passed on as news. This is extremely unethical. And this is done not only by the politicians. Quite often politicians are blamed for everything. It is just not done by the politicians. Politicians, of course, do it of late, since the political competition has also become so intense. They do it. And they have been doing it in many states, in smaller states, away from the prying eyes of newsmen, in different parts of the country. But it was not a kind of a pandemic. Now it is a pandemic. Corporates also do it. They have been doing it much more effectively and have not got exposed to that much extent as the politicians are. Even the administration, they do it. In fact, I remember when I was a cub reporter with the National Herald in Lucknow, and I was covering the police and crime. And of course, the way I was functioning those days, not many people now function also like that. One day, the city police chief called me and said, had I had the power to pay your newspaper advertisement, you could not have written like what you are being doing now. So this is the paid news phenomenon is there in the mindset of every administrator in one way or the other. Now, how you can prevent that? That is one aspect that needs to be discussed in a very wide way. People resort to device means to give paid news. Always it is not just direct cash. There are many other ways to assuage the feelings of an organization. It is a wide subject. Its methodologies are very different. But again, it is virtually a kind of an obstacle in the free flow of news and information. Just now we discussed about the Neera Radia tapes. How many journalists have been named? You all would know. Many of them have been named, and many of them are in very high positions. Some of them tried to very vocally create a defense for themselves, but others remain silent. How you solve these kinds of problems? How you solve these kinds of conflicts? Can a journalist alone do it? Can the whole newspaper organizations alone do it? You see, you have to also understand newspaper or a journalist is not functioning in isolation. They're part of the same society where everybody lives in. And if someone in the society has become so powerful to bamboozle anybody, it is going to affect everybody. Now, affected journalists today are silent, but possibly there is also a chance a new set of such people may be emerging at different levels. So how we can prevent that? The society has to take action to prevent all these kinds of things. Journalists alone can't do it. And everything is not so clear either. There is conflict within the system also. Recently, Justice G.R. Majithia, who was the chairman of the last wage board, expressed deep concern that newspaper industry finances remain an area of opaqueness. There is no legal compulsion on most newspaper enterprises to disclose their financial results, except for the few rare instances that they may publicly be traded companies. And this is something very important. Quite often we demand that political parties should have a transparent accounting system. But the media houses, the way they have to function in many ways, this aspect is not always clear. Can we make it really transparent? This remains a question. Because it's just not the media houses. We have seen in cases like Satyam also, this opaqueness was there, and because of that, such large fraud on the entire investors, on the government, on the taxpayers, on the entire tax system could be done. So it is easier said that it needs to have a transparent system, but how and who is going to implement that? Who is going to ask the newspaper magnates to follow a practice that would be really not opaque? But you may ask, how does that affect the journalist? Yes, it affects the functioning of a journalist, an individual journalist, or the entire journalistic community, because it affects the policy making of a news group. The policy making doesn't become transparent, it doesn't become ethical, and it doesn't become what exactly the people would like it to be. That means ultimate result would be there would be lots of compromises in the coverage of the events, the facts, the news, its display even. How a news is written and how a news is displayed, where it is displayed also matters much. So how it is going to happen? So this revenue model, we have to look at this revenue model of the newspapers, how we can change this revenue model, because it is just not a problem. Quite often we see it as a problem of the news operators. But in reality, it is just not the problem of news operators. The problem is much more and beyond that. Problem is of the entire society. The society will be stifled of getting what it really wants. So create a transparent, truthful news coverage. We have to create a system which is faithful not only to one or two individuals but to the entire society. So this was the problem within. Now let us see how does the terrorist groups impact this conflict scenario. We have seen there are Naxal hit areas in Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Maharashtra, entire northeast, Manipur, Nagaland, Assam. We have seen there are areas of conflicts at various places, armed conflicts. Jammu and Kashmir, there are problems. And apart from that, there are private armies in various parts of the country. It is just not limited to Bihar. In other parts also there are private armies who do not want that newsmen should function freely. We have seen of late what is happening in the areas of Chhattisgarh. It was just not a problem only for the armed constabulary, the policemen, but also in the functioning in the free movement of journalists there. They can't cover anything that goes against the Naxalites. They can't cover anything that goes against the interest of the constabulary or the policemen. And in many cases, journalists we have seen either have been killed or injured also. In Jammu and Kashmir, often we have seen how different militant groups function as censor for coverage, and in many cases we have also seen how they also organize what they want to be covered. If it is a blast, if it is any of their activity or action, they virtually send messages to the newsmen much beforehand. That is how you see the television cameras standing right at the place where an action is taking place. Is that ethical or not? Has been a question that has debated, because it gives an extra publicity to a cause possibly which is not there. In many areas of Northeast, especially in Manipur, we have seen how journalists are not allowed to function freely. I know some of the journalists were my personal friends who would not even pick up their phones for the fear that they would be traced where they are located. Their life is in danger. When their life is in danger, that means there can't be a free flow of news coverage. I would just like to give another example of what happened in Punjab in the 80s. You see, newspapers used to, those days only the newspapers were there, and there were not many TV channels. Newspapers used to write them as terrorists. One day they sent a letter to all newspapers that if you write terrorists from tomorrow, you will not be there. Call us militant. And that is how the word militant is now widely used for all these kind of people in the news media. So terrorism, that is what we are discussing, creates greater stress on journalists. There is censorship by terrorist groups in Jammu and Kashmir. International groups are functioning there. They also impose censorship. Even official agencies and security forces, they impose their censorship. Recently, you must have seen and must have read that the government organizations and government agencies have declared that they would not give any advertisement to the newspapers or news organizations who do not adhere to the basic government norms. And that is also another way of creating a conflict on, or imposing a conflict on journalists who are virtually not responsible for it. And if the funding is not there, how would a news system function? You must understand, collection of news is a very intensive area and it costs a lot of money. So you have to see that. We have discussed how local journalists are confined to their homes in different parts of the country. They frequently stop on way to their work. And even the Kashmir Press Guild, a body of senior journalists, have expressed concern over these kind of functioning as stress that should not be there on journalists, but that is unfortunately is there. We have discussed how it is in Manipur. And in that, there I would just like to mention one incident. There is a former secretary of Manipur Hill Journalists Union. He is called Mr. Drita. Insurgent groups barged into their house just to prevent coverage of factual news which he had done. He was not at home, so he is saved, but his family members had to bear the brunt. Maoist areas we have discussed quite in detail. But when journalists go out to meet Maoists on professional duty, there is another problem. Now you are going to meet a Maoist for professional coverage, but the policemen get a scent of it and they follow the journalist. And that hampers journalistic work because the policemen try to use the journalist to raid the Maoists, which they normally can't do. So this is another kind of conflict. This is a conflict of different interest. It is a conflict of ethics. And the journalistic ethic is to create again that open dialogue. And for that open dialogue, you have to talk to everybody, whosoever he is. You have to give his version as well. But the policeman has a different purpose, and they also try to brand journalists as a part of the Maoist groups that we have also seen. And many journalists have suffered for that reason also. Yes, now let us come to how a journalist can really prevent such a scenario. One problem with the media industry is it is not really flush with money except one or two houses. And it doesn't have much funds to spend on training journalists how to cover these difficult areas. And these are really very difficult areas to cover. You require lots of tax, you require lots of knowledge of law, international law, national law. You have to have the knowledge of the terrain. You need to know so many more things. But usually we find journalists lack on those trainings because nobody holds any proper training for them. Journalist professional bodies organize it from time to time, but they can't do it as intensely as it should be done for the journalists because they don't have much of a fund. And all these operations, all these activities need money. Training which should be normally helping not only the journalists but also in the functioning of the officials. The officials do not like such trainings. They see it is a nuisance. It is not their job. Journalists have to function. It is their business to cover news, so they should do it. They do not realize a proper news coverage helps the functioning of officials the most. Journalists have to train themselves, and security agencies also have to learn to help them train in conflict aspects. Only the defense organizes such training, but that is for a different purpose. When war breaks out, how a journalist should go and cover. But for the insurgent infested areas, so far, no such training has ever been conducted by any security agency as such. So we have to see these aspects. But one thing I must say, a basic aspect is, in any case of this kind of armed conflict, the first casualty is the truth. How a journalist can prevent that, that remains the question. Because the security agencies don't tell the truth, the insurgents don't tell the truth. Who will tell the truth to the journalist? A difficult question and remains difficult to answer. But I have one advice. The journalist, whenever getting into such a situation, first thing they always should do is to how to save their lives and save themselves. Because if you are living today, tomorrow you can do a better coverage. That must be the motto. One aspect and one problem that also affects the journalist is journalists are also not always free from bias. They are from the same society. They are coming from the same sets of people. They also see the same kinds of things. So sometimes the bias gets into them for either of the groups. And that is, again, not in the interest of, again, free and factual news coverage. I remember Harinder Baweja, a journalist with Tehelka, earlier she was with India Today, while covering the Punjab terrorism, she recollected that anti-Sikh riot shook her out of the secular environment she was raised in as a daughter of an Indian Air Force officer. For once, she says, I was made to realize my Sikh identity. So these are some of the problems a journalist faces at very individual level. But how you can be free out of bias, that remains a big question. But that you have to do, because a biased person can't be an impartial journalist. So this is all I have to tell you basically today, because this is an area which is very wide, and there is no limitation of this conflict area. Now you have realized that conflict spreads almost to everywhere, and anywhere. And unless you can reduce that aspect, you have your problems. You have the problems not only for you, you have the problems for the society, you have the problems for the entire news world. If you have any questions, I'm prepared to answer.
Well, you talked about what dilemma journalists face while covering such a situation.
Absolutely.
But now we come to the post-reporting things. Having reported all these issues, how one can find out whether this report was uh, free from bias, free from any kind of influences made by any party, etc. How a society can have eye on these things.
You see, I would
Is there
say,
any effort being made, like you are having media awards? So
yes,
such things are being done or not?
yes, these things are being done. It is not that these things are not being done. In fact, one good thing in the news world is the editorial meeting that happens every day.
Okay,
in the
we'll discuss
editors.
this, but before that, I am sorry to interrupt. We have a caller from Haryana,
Sure, and I would
so
like
we'll
to.
let us take up the question from her. Welcome you. Please ask your question.
थैंक यू सर। मैं ये पूछना चाह रही थी कि जो आप अगर जैसे समाज में कई बार ये घटनाएं सुनने में आते हैं कि भाई जैसे कोई चोरी करता है तो लोग उसे पकड़ लेते हैं और खुद ही मतलब उसे सजा देने लग जाते हैं, मतलब इतनी मतलब बेरहमी से मारते हैं कि वो मर ही जाता है या फिर उसके वो कोई अपंग हो जाता है। तो इस बारे में मैं पूछना चाहती हूँ कि ये मतलब इसके लिए क्या जिम्मेदार है, मतलब लोगों की सोच कि आजकल लोग इतने मतलब उनमें पेशेंस नहीं रहा है, या फिर कोई मतलब कानून व्यवस्था हमारी इतनी मतलब ढीली है कि इस पर काबू नहीं पा सकती। तो इस बारे में बताइए।
Well, this is a more a question of law and order, not of the reporting sort of thing, because the journalist will report what the things will happen in the society. They are not bound to stop all these kind of things, I think. What you have to say?
No, basically, what she was asking is, well, this is really a question that often a journalist faces. That if he goes there for a proper coverage, and especially as we have seen, especially in case of Haryana, as it is happening in the Khap Panchayats, when journalists try to report that, we have seen how the journalists were chased, beaten up, and journalists had to really scurry for his life. So this is virtually, I would say, the societal attitude that is also responsible for that. It's just not merely a law and order issue. Law and order issue, of course, is there, but it is a societal attitude, and that is what I was saying all through. That the society has to look for how to change its attitude to the news coverage, because covering any event, for that matter, helps the society correct its own role. If some journalist is giving some coverage of any event for that matter, the way it is happening, what is an event coverage? Virtually creating a mirror for the society. So, why should the society fear the mirror and try to break the mirror? Journalist is virtually a mirror. So, this is, I think, gradually with larger education, because literacy is just not education. Today, we are just literate in many areas. So, with larger education and exposure, I think these issues are going to be gradually solved.
Okay. Now we were discussing about that,
Yeah.
about the how.
The bias, how we see the bias and how it is done. You see, every day.
Look, given an instance of Naxalism, now we have to test whether the Naxalism reporting is hostile or friendly or what, how it has changed. So how one can do this?
So normally I would say that a journalist should cover as it is happening. He should not be either friendly or hostile to any situation. So that aspect remains there, because if he's either friendly or hostile, that means there is a bias in him. And these aspects, I can say, is discussed in detail at every day's news editorial department discussion every morning. And it is discussed very threadbare. It is a very animated discussion. So that is one aspect that is being taken care of. Editors do take it, journalists themselves do take it, reporters do it. Others who are involved in the process, they also discuss it, and they also discuss that how, since next evening, their coverage is going to improve upon that. So this is one aspect. The other is, as we in the IMC did a study after this Kargil conflict. We studied 300 newspapers, Indian, foreign. Foreign means basically US and UK and Pakistan. And we found one aspect, and very interesting aspect was that all newsmen are anyway citizen of one country or another. And in their coverage, we found that their basic citizenship gets reflected. That means they carry their national bias into the news coverage. I will give one instance. Now, there was a national newspaper in Delhi. It was virtually gulping down all the contradictory reports that were being given by the various government and security agencies. And in one report, they are carrying those contradictory figures, those contradictory statements also. We mentioned that. We also found there was a Guardian correspondent who was based in Delhi, but she will remain in Delhi one day and give the coverage of the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi, security agencies from Delhi, that will be on the top line. But at the bottom of it, she will carry
Sorry
the
to
stories.
interrupt you again. I have another caller from Haryana.
Yes, please.
Welcome. Please ask your question.
जी सर, मैं ये कहना चाह रही थी कि अभी आपने जैसे मैंने पूछा था आपसे सवाल, तो मैं ये बोलना चाह रही थी कि अखबार में भी अगर ऐसी मतलब समाचार छपते हैं तो भी कोई कार्रवाई नहीं होती, क्योंकि बहुत सारी भीड़ ने ऐसा मतलब किया होता है। और मतलब और एक और आजकल जो सवाल उठ रहे हैं मीडिया की स्वतंत्रता को लेकर कि भाई जैसे आतंकवादी घुस आए थे हमारे ताज होटल में, तो उसमें मतलब पूरा लाइव कवरेज दिखाया था, तो आतंकवादियों को वहाँ की जो पोजीशन थी कमांडर की और जो वहाँ पे लड़ रहे थे लड़ाई, उनकी पूरी जानकारी मिल गई थी, जिससे मतलब हमको काफ़ी नुकसान पहुँचा। तो इस पे मतलब सवाल उठते हैं कि मीडिया कितनी मतलब होना चाहिए उनको कि वो साफ दिखा रही है लाइव, और हमको मतलब देश को इससे नुकसान पहुँच रहा है, तो इस बारे में पूछना चाहते हैं।
नहीं, आपका कहना किसी हद तक सही है, पर पूरा सही नहीं है। देखिए, सवाल ये है कि इसमें भी एक बहुत बड़ी अंतर्द्वंद छिपा हुआ है कि कोई घटना घट रही है, उसका हम बताएं कि न बताएं। अगर हम नहीं बताते तो आप कहेंगे आपने हमें बताया नहीं। अगर हम बताते हैं तो हाँ, उसका लाभ भी किसी को मिल सकता है, तो हम किस तरह से बताएं। देखिए, ऐसा नहीं है कि जो अखबारों में काम करते हैं इसके बारे में सचेत नहीं है, हम बहुत ज़्यादा सचेत होते हैं। पर हमारे साथ जो सबसे पहली प्राथमिकता होती है, जो भी घटना घट रही है उसको आप तक पहुंचाना। तो हम पहुंचाएं तो कैसे पहुंचाएं? अगर हम पहुंचाते हैं, अगर आप जैसे कहा कुछ टेररिस्ट ग्रुपों का कुछ उससे फ़ायदा हो रहा था बॉम्बे की घटना के हिसाब से, हाँ उस वक्त हुआ था, क्योंकि कई जिस तरह से खास करके वहाँ घटना शुरू हुई थी, पहली बात तो जो सिक्योरिटी एजेंसीज थी या पुलिस था, उन्होंने भी सबसे पहले ये नहीं बताया कि ये कोई टेररिस्टों का आत्मघाती हमला है। सबसे पहली जो खबर आई थी बॉम्बे पुलिस की तरफ से, उन्होंने ये कहा था कि ये जो घटना है शायद बॉम्बे के कुछ माफिया गैंग्स के बीच में ये लड़ाई हो रही है। तब जब तक अखबार वालों को सही बात पता न चले, वो कब तक अपने जो करेक्टिव स्टेप्स हैं उसको कैसे लें। तो ये सारी समस्याएं आती हैं, ऑपरेशन लेवल पर बहुत सारी चीज़ें समस्याएं होती है। पर ये मैं मानता हूँ कि उसके बाद से अगर आप देखें, जब भी कोई घटना घटती है, सारे अखबार वाले खुद ही ऐसे स्टेप्स ले रहे हैं जिसकी वजह से उस घटना की पुनरावृत्ति नहीं हो रही है।
We were talking about the
yes, they're talking
national
about national and international. So I was saying that the Guardian correspondent, next morning she would fly to Pakistan and file the report in a reverse manner. Now, why was she doing that? Because at that time, if you see, the British government had virtually a neutral stand, that they are putting India and Pakistan at a balance. So she was trying to create that balance in a news coverage, of course, not in a very nice manner. Now, I will just give another example of how the American newspapers were doing that. Those days, if you remember, in 1998, America was very closely trying to support India. And American newspapers were carrying news which were very favorable to India. And in some cases, the Pakistan at that time was not their enemy. In 98, it was after 2001 that they became their enemy. In their headlines, they were mentioning Pakistan, they were mentioning enemies. So these kind of biases creep in at national level and international level, and this is what the studies independent organizations that do, that they bring it out. International Federation of Journalists, they also do such studies, and from there also these kind of things come out. Apart from that, there are some human rights organizations, they also do such studies, and this helps the coverage of the news system in a continuous manner. So this is not restricted at any point of time. This is a continuous issue and continuous affair, and news persons also learn from their mistakes, from whatever they do, right or wrong, and they try to improve upon that. It's a very dynamic system. No one solution is good for all the time. So solutions are tried to be found out from time to time. They're evolved from time to time, and new issues come out.
So one thing was seeing from the national perspective. The other thing was seeing from the truth perspectives. So on both yardstick, a number of variables may be different from the different part of the things. Like as you said that the national media was not giving contradictory things, which
They are
were
carrying contradictory things in one report.
one report, but not.
But they are not trying to analyze it. That is what I was trying to do. They are not trying to analyze what normally a newsman should do. Newsman's job is what? He must cross-check the facts.
Okay.
He was not cross-checking the facts. So
But
when you get so much overall so-called nationalism, this kind of errors also happen.
But in some cases, maybe they were trying to get the facts verified, but the sources they tried to contact me might not be revealing the facts.
No. Now say there is agency A. It is giving a figure. I am giving a very simple figure that there are 100 casualties.
Okay.
The agency B, it is saying no, there are only 20 casualties.
Okay.
Now the newspaper, they were not trying to say that 100, they were saying 100, that they were saying 20. They added 120 is the figure.
Okay. This is wrong.
So that is where I am saying that they should not do. They must cross-check the facts that is before them. And it is not difficult to check.
We have one call, another caller from Haryana. Please ask your question.
मैं ये कहना चाह रही थी कि जैसे न्यूज चैनल्स आजकल स्टिंग ऑपरेशन चलाते हैं लोगों के मतलब जो गलत काम करते हैं कुछ भी कैसा जो देश के विरोध काम होता है देश के विरुद्ध जो काम होता है तो ये कहाँ तक ठीक है कि वो शायद अपनी मतलब चैनल की मार्केटिंग करने के लिए ये करते हों और एक मतलब आजकल जैसे कोई भी न्यूज आ रही होती है तो उसको इतना बढ़ा चढ़ाकर बताते हैं कि देखना मत भूलिए या फिर ये आपकी जिंदगी बदल सकता है या फिर सावधान हो जाइए पता नहीं कैसे कैसे मतलब वो स्लोगन देते हैं या तो लोगों को डराते हैं जैसे कि ग्लेशियर पिघल रहे हैं या फिर कुछ तूफान आया है या फिर जैसे ये मंदी चल रही है तो हमें भी मतलब कुछ भी ऐसा तो ये इसके बारे में बताइए।
देखिए स्टिंग ऑपरेशंस के बारे में कई प्रकार के सवाल उठ चुके हैं कि वो एथिकल है या नहीं है। लार्जली जो सीरियस जर्नलिस्ट हैं दे डोंट एग्जैक्टली बिलीव इन स्टिंग ऑपरेशन एंड वी हैव सीन इन मेनी ऑफ द स्टिंग ऑपरेशंस द वे दे हैव बीन कंडक्टेड इज आल्सो हैविंग देयर बायस इंक्लूडिंग द मोस्ट डिस्कस्ड सो कॉल्ड आर्म्स परचेज स्टिंग स्कैंडल। नाउ newsmen are not supposed to virtually do that kind of a sting coverage because sting means what? We're not trying to really tell the truth. We're trying to plant something maybe which is not there. And we're trying to also function as a prosecutor at the same time. And this is not the job of a journalist. He is not a prosecutor. So sting operations, personally I do not support the way many of the organizations do. Sometimes it may be okay, but even then largely the ethical question remains whether we should allow those devices to create a news which is in reality not there. So sting is unethical, and I believe these kind of operations virtually have not led us, whether it is the political sting or whether it is any other kind of sting, it has not led us to the perpetrator of the crime. The bribes were given by these organizations themselves. Now, where did they get those money? That also remains a question. Crores of rupees were shelled out in supposed bribes, which is all, in reality, if you say, they are not exactly bribes. But where did they get the money? Nobody has tried to investigate those news agencies. So, this is also another question that we need to answer. I think best journalism can be done even without a sting.
Okay, last question I would like to ask you. Suppose these are the things and the mass communication students want to do or research, whether the reporting, any reportings, your timeline, suppose how the reporting is changing over the years. So, what the suggestion would you like to give you? How do they design their research?
Well, you see, normally a journalist does his research almost every day to do all these kinds of things. Now, as a newsman, you have a lot of flexibility to do, but when you are a student, your flexibility gets reduced. So, what you must do is actually to look for one particular event or subject and then start doing research backwards. Now, say you want to do a research on this sting operation. Now, how you would do it? You have to create a hypothesis whether the sting was real or not. And backward, you have to work out to find out who were involved persons, what were their aim, what were they trying to find out, whether they have really find out the truth or the truth that was created was really not there. So you have to create a chart, and according to that you have to move out so far, and you will possibly find out what I was telling you without doing, of course, that much of a deep research, that what and from where these sting operators get their money. Nobody has done a research on that aspect. So these are one of the aspects. There may be many more aspects. You see, when you are doing a research, one thing you must remember, you must look for a focused subject. Don't try to make it a very wide subject and do a research. That is not possible. Look for a focused subject, whether it is in a crime area, whether it is in a, say, you want to do a study on Manipur, what is happening and all that there. Keep it restricted to Manipur, don't try to mix it up with Bastar or any other area. So if you can do that, and of course in the research process always you have to move backward, step by step, to find out from where it started and how it started and what, and then you can of course give your suggestions or recommendations in the other part of it. That's a different aspect, that is in the conclusion.
So, well, friend, today we try to know how the journalists have bring out the things, the true things to limelight, and how they struggle for getting the truth. So, this was the main crux of the today lectures, and as you have all witnessed that due to coverage of the stories, due to coverage of the events, we have been able to sort out the various problems, and we are in a process also to improving the situation, whether it's in corruption, whether it's a law and order problem, or whatever it is. The media has helped us, and also be helpful in coming years and
I
coming
would just
decades
add
also.
to it that media also needs help to solve
Yeah.
out many of their problems
Many
that
of
they are
the
facing.
Yeah, but at the same times, it also beneath certain study which gives light to the media, which will help them to go on the right tracks. So, with this word, we would like to conclude the lecture here, and I would like to thank all of you for watching the lecture. And on your behalf, I thank Professor Shivaji Sarkar for giving such an insightful
Thank
lecture
you,
on this very topic.
Renji.
Thank you very much.